Hi, everyone. Welcome to Founder Voices, the podcast that amplifies the stories of founders and leaders driving change with purpose and integrity. I'm your host, Clement Akron, founder and CEO of Cottage Factory. As you know, Cottage Factory is a venture studio that works with startups, SMEs, and charities to ideate, develop value proposition, build business models that are effective and successful, find product market fit, help them to pivot and to scale. Today's guest is someone whose work across business, social impact, and governance has shaped boardrooms and leadership cultures across the world. Joining us today is Patrick Dunne, an experienced chair, serial social entrepreneur, venture capital and private equity investor. Patrick currently chairs Boardelta, Royal Voluntary Service, ESSA, and is still involved with us Young. And again, he's going to tell us more about how that kicked off and where he is with them now. He's also a visiting professor at Cranfield. Patrick has served as the founding chair of EY Foundation, former chair of LEAF, Confronting Conflict, and as a member of the General Council of University at the University of Warwick. He's the author of the highly regarded book, Boards, and co-author of 5 Generations at Work. In 2023, he was honored with an OBE in the King's Birthday Honours List. Congratulations once again, Patrick, for his services to charity and philanthropy in Africa and the UK. Today, we'll be exploring governance. We'll be exploring leadership. We'll be exploring impact. We'll be exploring the role that founders play and continue to play in shaping strong and purpose-led boards. Patrick, welcome to Founder Voices. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here, and I love what you're doing.
Excellent. Okay, so tell us more about yourself, Patrick. Let's get to know who is Patrick and how did you end up here?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know how I ended up here. Where I started was as a kid in Toxteth in Liverpool, Irish immigrant family, at quite a difficult time for the city when I was growing up. I think it's sort of notoriously famous for lots of things at that time. I was one of 6. There was extremely high unemployment in my street. It was quite a sort of violent, kind of challenging environment. So as a kid, I suppose I learned a lot about conflict management. I had pretty good risk antennae. Things were quite useful later when you serve on boards, but expectations of us, particularly in the Irish community, were really low at the time. I'm dyslexic. Mildly dyslexic, and that presented some challenges at school. So I was not very good at anything that needed writing, but I was very lucky because I was okay at maths, and so I managed to get to grammar school at the time, get 2 buses across the city there, which was a pretty daunting prospect. I think when you've got a different blazer to everyone else in the street, you tend to hide it rather than sort of wear it with pride, and you're then a bit of a target for people. But I managed after grammar school to get to the University of Warwick to maths and stats degree, and that completely changed my life and my family's life, really. And I never really looked back from that point. I mean, as a kid, I had this little expression because I had a lot of difficult days. If I had a good day and if something went well, if someone was kind to me, I used to think, well, imagine what you could do now. You've made one little step towards a better life. So I was driven very much by wanting to have, live in a different place, have a different kind of lifestyle, and not get drawn into crime. That was one thing, that was so easy for people to do in where I grew up, and avoiding that is not necessarily that easy. But I did, and I'm so glad I did. And as I say, once I got to Warwick, then things just happened. I got a decent job and got another one, and so on. So I suppose the real me is kind of still, Irish immigrant, Scouser, love Everton Football Club, those kind of things. And I go back every few weeks to see my mum, who's now 89. Very poor sight, but sharp as a button, and she was one of the main reasons I've ever had any success. Her thirst and belief in education and her drive and her values been really important, I think.
Excellent. You talked about grammar school, and
they're gone now.
I know a number of people that would give credit to the opportunity to attend grammar school. I remember one of my lecturer back in university, and over a cup of coffee, and he told me a story. I was baffled, and he said, his teacher just put him forward for the grammar exam. He didn't even know what the grammar exams were. His parents didn't have any idea. It was from a really poor background, and that was a life-changing experience. From the back of that, he ended up in Cambridge and went on to study his master's and PhD in a well-known university in Germany, and the rest is history. So what's your take on people that say, oh, we don't need grammar schools, this selective educational system, it's not working? What's your view on that?
It's very complicated because it isn't a fair, or it wasn't a fair system. You take an exam on a day, and the rest of your life is affected by that one sort of exam. Our teacher didn't tell us we were taking the exam. We had no idea we were taking it because she didn't want to worry us. And the expectation where I was, well, no one, not many are going to pass it anyway, which isn't right, but that was the sort of expectation at the time. I feel incredibly lucky, privileged, and interestingly, the school I went to was one of the few schools that did further maths A-level, and I wouldn't have been able to get to Warwick if it hadn't had further maths A-level, because you need further maths A-level. And many years later, I discovered through Warwick that a lot of schools were dropping further maths A-level because they didn't have the teachers who had the capacity or capability to do it, which incensed me because, that's basically denying kids, and they were typically in poorer areas, these schools dropping it, from that opportunity. So through Warwick, we founded something which has become the Further Maths Network. That actually led to the creation of Warwick in Africa, which we might talk about later. But I think my feeling as a kid was life was horribly unfair, and you get a few lucky breaks, and you can either observe those lucky breaks or you can take them. And so I got a lot of stick for going to grammar school. I was bullied a lot in the street, a lot at school for not being. so you're suddenly this displaced person because you're sort of. But actually,
crowd,
yeah, but worth it. You take whatever luck you get, and sadly, a lot of people don't get those lucky breaks, and so. But if you do, the system might not be fair. But if you've been given something, maybe what to other people might seem an unfair opportunity, then you can let it go or you can take it. And my view is take it. I think there is a terrible issue in the country at the moment. If you look at kids on free school meals, one of the consequences of me going to grammar school was that I was on free school meals, and then you had to queue up for your tickets and face quite a lot of abuse in the queue for being. And people used to call us paddy scum. That was the phrase they used for us. It was pretty horrible. Initially I used to sell my tickets because I could get. You could sell them, and I'd buy a punnet of chips for about 10% of the cost of what I get for the ticket. And then on a Friday, I'd treat myself and have a Mars bar. So not the best of diets. Appalling diet, but we needed the money. That was the way it was. But I think grammar school system wasn't fair, but it was a route for kids in poverty out. You know, it was basically football, boxing, or grammar school for sort of when I was a kid. And if the grammar school thing was closed, then... And if you look at the leadership of many UK companies today, you know, the grammar school generation's retired out pretty much now. And I think the social diversity amongst CEOs in the UK is abysmal. I mean, you know, it's gone backwards. It wasn't brilliant. It wasn't brilliant ever, but it's actually gone backwards. And then you think about, you know, 2 million plus kids on free school meals or whatever the new designation will be. You know, that's a lot of people not getting opportunity.
Would you say then, Patrick, that those opportunities are lesser now, like the kind of opportunities that you had in your time? Some argue that, you know, things you know, that these opportunities are few and far between now, that you could be.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I don't think it's more or less. I think it's different. You know, when I was a kid, I had 3 jobs when I was 10, and I had. Then you didn't have the internet. You had to go knocking on doors, potentially dangerous, knock on doors, and the ratio of getting a job is probably 1 in 100. So that's a lot of doors, that kind of thing. I think many young people today are going through the same experience, but they're going through it online. So, you know, we know from the EY Foundation, people are, you know, applying, you know, massive numbers of times and not getting through. One of the big things we've done at EY Foundation is change a lot of companies' recruitment filters on their websites, because it used to be the case that a lot of them would have a 5 GCSE hurdle. And so kids would apply, they wouldn't know what the hurdles were, which is one thing which I think you should be open about what the hurdles are. You save people a lot of time and you save yourself a lot of time if you're an employer. But we found a youngster who'd applied, you know, more than 100 times, never got replies, didn't know why. We thought it'd be interesting. We did some research with a number of companies, and we found out, you know, you put in how many GCSEs you've got or you're expected to get, and if you put 4, no chance. You know, you don't meet the hurdle. Now, clearly, in a world where there's mass application, companies have to filter somehow, but you need to be open about it, in our view. And I think also some of the tests now, you know, to get a job, it's a job getting a job for a young person. I mean, the amount of effort they have to put in. And some of this stuff that people ask for is really good and really necessary and really helpful. And some of it's really not. It's just, you know, it's just a waste of time, really. You're not helping anybody with some of the things people ask for. So I think there's all that going on. I think the internet opens up a set of possibilities that's very different to, you know, when I was at that stage. It was literally, there was no internet, didn't have a phone. You walked around to get a job. So your opportunities are fairly limited in that world. They're more now, but there's a lot more competition for everything now. So I'd say it's about as difficult, but in a different way.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. Yes, you were in Senegal and now you're in Zurich. So tell us about, you know, what you, and you from Zurich, you're off to Ghana. Tell us more about these initiatives that you're involved in and how, you know, you shape them and what excites you about what you do. Yeah.
So I mentioned my keenness for helping kids, particularly around maths, in kids in poverty, around maths. And so having helped Warwick with setting up the what became the Further Maths Network, I had been reading about problems in Africa with maths education in particular. So, not great capacity in schools, so very large class sizes, quality of teaching variable because of a lack of funds to invest in training. So I thought this model that we had for the Further Maths Network, where we would deploy volunteers and faculty from the university to upskill the teachers and teach the children and bring the high potential kids to Warwick to inspire them about, if you actually work hard, if you've got the talent, you've got the potential, if you apply that, work hard, take advantage of these opportunities, you could be here, and that's a gateway. Because the employability stats for a university like Warwick on maths are just, you have to try hard not to get a job, basically. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we did a pilot in somewhere in Africa, maybe in a township or a slum school, where we used more or less the same model, and we did in South Africa in 2006, and it was a big hit. One of the things I'll be doing next week in Ghana is visiting some of the schools in Accra that we work with still to this day. So Warwick Campus has trained over 1,000 teachers, and there's probably 750,000 kids who've benefited from the volunteer teaching in the classrooms over the last nearly 20 years. And then when I was on the ground and Warwick Campus has been in Tanzania, Ghana, South Africa, in urban slums and in rural areas of high poverty. When I've been on the ground, I was noticing all these big systemic problems that no one was even talking about. So the ineffectiveness of scholarship programs, the lack of faculty, or in a lot of African universities, they're full up, populations are burgeoning, can't cope with the volume. The lack of availability of African-led research and visibility of it. So I decided and we did this in 2016, to found something called ESSA, Education Sub Saharan Africa, to basically gather evidence where it was available, or go get it if it wasn't, which would inform decisions being made about these big systemic problems. So, for example, in Ghana, you got a sense that the universities didn't have enough faculty, but no one could tell you by how much or in what areas. So we essentially pulled together a group of people who had the access to the data. So this is working with the government, with the African Association of Universities, with MasterCard Foundation, who funded it, and the Population Reference Bureau had all the demographic data, because we were interested in how is this going to develop. And we modelled Ghana. It only took us 6 months to do that. And we showed that actually the faculty shortage was about 50%. We also discovered there were only 10 women professors at the time, and there were very few women in faculties. So actually, you've got a hole, if you like, of say 4,500 faculty members, and you're only trying to fill that with half the available population. And then you ask how many PhDs graduate a year, because the government had a qualification that you had to have a PhD to be a faculty member, and you've got 200, not all of whom want to go into academia. So you look at that and you go, wow, this hole is going to get bigger, guys. So what do we need to do about that? And then we did that then in 7 other countries. And one of the reasons I was in Senegal last week was that we have been making big strides in terms of training, supporting African researchers to fill in the gaps of evidence that there are around education. And so we've been raising money to give small grants to local researchers who can work on the problems that they've identified, so they've not been identified for them, and then training them how to pitch for more money to get for follow-on funding for their research. We're also looking at providing some statistical training and statistical buddies for them, because for their research to be robust and credible, it's got to be statistically sound. So we're doing that too. So ESSA was formed in 2016. That's had a number of big hits. The African Education Research-Based Database probably being the biggest hit. So this is a free online resource of all the research of quality that we can find, led by Africans. That's proving a big hit, and it's creating visibility of who are the top African researchers in education, what stuff there is there, so people don't reinvent the wheel, and what's missing, so people can go and find the wheels that are missing. And ESSA now has, I'm the only non-African on the board. The team, the leadership team is all African. Predominantly the staff is African, and they're based virtually across Africa. So it's now, we have a legal entity in Ghana and one in the UK. Some donors want to give money to an African entity, some to non-African entities, so that way we can bridge that. And we're going to celebrate our 10th year with a bang next year. We've had quite a lot of impact, and that's a very that's a very challenging thing to do in practice. It sounds good when I tell the story, but it's actually, the team have been amazing in terms of overcoming lots of different challenges.
Yeah, exciting. So how sustainable are these projects? Because you've been you've made mention of a few funding streams like Visa or MasterCard, I think you mentioned. How sustainable are these projects?
So it depends really, and I think the environment at the moment is very challenging for any charity. So even something as big as the Royal Voluntary Service, which I chair in the UK, maybe we'll come on to that in a bit, but it's not easy raising money because people haven't got a lot of spare cash. So the important thing I found is to work out what type of money you need. So ESSA, for example, needs long-term commitments. If we're going to work on systemic problems, we need a long-term commitment. So who are the people who would provide 3-year, 5-year money? Very few. So there's not a lot you can go to, but they are extremely good. They know the space and so on. So ESSA doesn't raise kind of retail funding. It just has a growing group of substantial foundations, like Gates, MasterCard, Hilton, these kind of people who really believe in what we're doing, think it's got big bang per buck, and want to help us, change the system. That's very different to a direct delivery charity like Warwick in Africa or Confronting Conflict, where you can have a broader number and type of funders. So if you look at RVS, for example, we probably half our income we generate ourselves through the hospital, cafes, trolley services, and other sort of retail-like type activities that we have. We have some foundations that are particularly keen on a particular project that we might have. So that might be poverty alleviation in a particular place. It could be dementia services. It could be transport. There's a desperate shortage of people to take people to hospital in the UK with, failing rural bus services and other challenges in rural areas, in urban areas. So we do a lot of that, and that's a lot of people volunteering their time and a lot of people donating individually, in their place. The lunch clubs that we do for people who aren't going to get a hot meal. Similarly, you have people who live locally who want to support that. So I think there are common challenges across the charity social sector. You can only really get social impact investment really if there's going to be some sort of return, albeit lower than a commercial one. So you can raise social impact investment to fund retail services or other things, which in themselves then generate the capital, and so they're sustainable. But you need a good funding mix, and obviously at the moment in Africa, a major challenge is the effective withdrawal of US aid, which is a colossal thing, and so there's huge pressure on everybody else to sort of make up in terms of the activities that they were funding. So it's hard to get new things funded, but all you can do is have a really good proposition. It's exactly the same as a business. Have a really good proposition. It's impact rather than profit, and have a really good lean team. Deliver what you say you're going to do, and the funders will change. People are interested in different things at different times. People change within foundations, so it's a bit like a company, really, in that sense. Except you don't have always that reliable, or not so reliable, source of your own income. But if you can go and get some of that does help. That does help a lot.
Yeah. So from your experience, what's the real-term impact of cuts in international development funding that you made mention to US EID, for instance?
I think there's one positive, and there's quite a lot of negatives. The one positive I'd say is that in some countries there is now a sufficiently large pool of wealthy people and wealthy corporates who actually could, if they chose to, and many do already. So this is not starting from zero, but you could see a lot more people feeling they want to help out, they want to solve some of these challenges. It's well researched about aid dependence and all of that. I think the problem with what's happening now is it's very abrupt, so there is no transition period really. It's just like off a cliff, and that's always going to be a lot more difficult to deal with. But if you look at across the world, the way many communities, societies coped with the pandemic, which was kind of like a drop off a cliff. People came together. If you look at what RVS did to, the vaccination centres, getting food to people, it was extraordinary. The number of people who really felt they ought to do something. They felt that this was a time where you needed to help your community. It's inspiring, really, and I think there are already. We know there's some of that already happening. So if you look at the withdrawal of retroviral drugs for AIDS, which is a particular, very specific problem, people are trying to fill that breach that's been left because people didn't have a long time. Imagine you were told you're going to lose your retroviral drugs in a month. How are you going to pay for them? How are you going to source that? So I think there's that good thing. I think it's a major disruption, and of course, alongside that, and you had prior to that, with the UK with DFID and all that, that was a similar sort of thing, maybe not quite as abrupt, but similar sort of thing. There's pressure in most countries to focus on their own populations, not exclusively, but probably in priority. And you look in the UK and you see the problems that we have across society. You can understand why people say the things they do, but that's to miss what I think is an incredible opportunity, as well as challenge. So if you look at Africa, if you look in the Five Generations book, there's I think it's on page 27. I'm a geek for remembering these things, but there's a series of population pyramids for Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa. And of course, for most of the world, it's a sort of fairly narrow funnel, but narrowing at the base. So increasingly aging populations in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Africa's like a little equilateral triangle. It's amazing. And there's already, about 1.4 billion people in Africa, and we will see another billion. So quite soon, 1 in 4 of the world's population will be African. If you think, that'll be 2 to 2.5 billion. I mean, the people are hedging their bets on what it will be because of falling birth rates, even in Africa. So you think all those people are going to need, educating, feeding, clothing. We'll use stuff. I mean, and how do we do that in an environmentally good way? And how do we do that in a way that creates, wealth for Africans, as well as wealth for the world? And how can we take that idea and think about our falling populations and the things that we all want and like in terms of, a whole range of things? And maybe instead of being frightened by immigrants, actually we welcome them, as many people already do, because they're going to help us with our problems as well. And being of Irish heritage, when the Irish are fantastic migrators. There's a museum in Dublin, the Epic Museum. It's an amazing museum. It's a bit like the Ellis Island Museum in New York in reverse. It's like a museum of immigration. And if you look at the contribution those people made, whether that be helping to build the tube, whether it be, staffing US police, whatever it might be, a bit like, the Windrush generation and many people from many countries around the world have helped the UK out before. I think if we could do that in a balanced way, so it's not a colonial way or a usurious way, but it's a fair trade way, I think it could be quite exciting. I personally don't think many companies in the UK have got their head around what their Africa strategy is. I think most of them have got it in the too difficult box, don't understand it, and we'll miss a big opportunity. It's the biggest growth market for the world in the next 30 years. You just look at the numbers, and you can either let that go, or you can think, okay, so how could we do that? Could we recruit some African people in Africa, in the UK, understand the market, find out what will work, all of those things can work. And education is probably one of those, there's another 1 billion people need educating. That's a massive education market, really is, at a time when schools are closing in the UK, when universities are under pressure, just think about that.
It's really interesting, Patrick. So are you of the opinion then, because oftentimes when people talk about Africa, they talk about the people and this complete, we sort of just avoid the question of governance and talk about the people, which is quite interesting, because we know the people have a lot of potential, like you rightly pointed out, youngest, fastest growing, middle class and aspiring middle class in most African countries. So what about the issue around government? How do we, like, for instance, with the work you're doing, do you see support from the government for, the work you're doing in Africa?
Yeah, so I think as well, I think Africans will leapfrog many other places in terms of governance. Look at the way Africa leapfrogged in mobile phone payments. I think, a lot of the techniques for decision making, a lot of the techniques of governance, actually, I think there'll be a lot of creativity in Africa, is my view. I know from, the ESSA board, a fantastically talented group, come up with some great thoughts and ideas. So I think it's about sort of engaging each other in these things. I was in Lesotho towards the end of last year, and they've got a new corporate governance code. And what was interesting there was they had the launch of that, and I was one of the speakers. And the code was devised by Africans. They researched what everyone else was doing, but it was devised by Africans. One of the most interesting things was the government wants to improve the reputation for governance in Lesotho, so it's supportive of this code, and they gave it a name, the Machlema Code, after a very famous guy from Lesotho a couple of hundred years ago, who was traveling around the region, which was quite conflict-ridden at the time, and more or less preaching, peace. Actually, let's get on together. Let's sell each other stuff. Let's kind of do things properly. Let's look after the people who can't look after themselves. Let's do all these things. Amazing guy, folklore sort of hero. And then they just code out.
Almost like a guy with a prophetic zeal.
Sorry?
I said almost like a guy with a prophetic zeal.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And then, but the other thing that was quite interesting was the politicians said, we want the companies to sign up to this code. So the business leaders said, yeah, fine, we will, but we want you politicians to do the same. Really interesting. That's really innovative. We didn't do that in the UK with the Cadbury Code or, the Higgs Review, which I was involved in. We didn't think of that. Actually, there is the Nolan Code, which, sort of dated but gets refreshed. But if you look at what's happened in, particularly the last, I won't single out any party, but, look at the last 20 years, we could have done with better governance. So I think there'll be a lot of innovation in Africa around governance. I'm very supportive. If people ask for a view, ask for, training stuff, I will always do that. But I always come from the point of view of humility that, this is not you adopting our model. This is not. So, the training I do is based on, much more around self-discovery and self-realization by asking, the right questions. And then people, I think, will find the appropriate way for their size of company, where it is, what the government regulations are, what the culture is, that way. I think there could be a significant boost to the governance in the education sector. But I don't think that should come about by me or anyone else, from the north saying this is what you should do. I think it should come about by people realizing that with good governance, you can have more impact, you can make more money, you can do that responsibly, and it's more sustainable because people trust you. I've just published a LinkedIn article this week around trust, and I've called it From Deficit to Default, because I think there is a deficit of trust in the world at the moment, and it's not the default.
I don't mean. Why is that the case, Patrick? In your experience, why?
I think because of people's experiences. What have they experienced of, politicians, business, the press, all that. It's those experiences which have conditioned that. That's not to say all people of a certain, all politicians are corrupt. They certainly aren't. I mean, I know a lot of them are really dedicated public servants and really want to do the right thing. But as ever, those people who aren't really spoil it for the others. And so I'm in this piece, I'm saying, actually we need to show leadership around trust, and we need to call it out when people betray that trust. We can't just watch it go by. We need to stand up, and that's a universal thing. I think is not a holier than thou type of piece. It's a practical kind of here are some things to think about to build trust, to restore trust if it's lost.
No, you're right. Without trust, there's no cooperation and there's no collaboration. And most of our institutions are based on trust. I mean, the financial sector is based on trust. You invest and you
Completely.
trust the person with your money. Democracy is based on trust. Religious institutions are based on trust. And one could argue that our ability to cooperate in very large numbers has been one of our strengths as humans. So with the impact of what is happening now around the world, I mean, some argue that it's a natural cycle. Others feel no, it's not. There's something fundamentally has gone wrong. I mean, for example, democracy, one could argue in the West is going through a crisis period now. In your view, I mean, I'll look out for your article. What do you think we can do to address these problems?
I think it's about us as individuals, and if you're in the really lucky position of being in a leadership position, you need to step up and you need to role model what you think is the right things to do. You need to not tolerate. I don't mean in a dogmatic, disciplinarian kind of way, but if you see behaviour that's at odds with the culture that you believe is the right culture for your organisation, call it out. Fire that top salesman who is appalling with women, or fire that person who lies all the time. Do something about it. Now, I know employment law sometimes makes all these things difficult, but at the end of the day, if you don't, and you have to, your actions as a leader are amplified, and also it tells people, what you need to get on here. Cutting corners, being abusive to people, being disingenuous with the truth, these are not things that are going to get you on here. So join in or find another place. But I think there is an element of steel. This often, when you talk on this subject, often sounds a bit fluffy and I want world peace type thing. I think it's actually much harder than that. And I think one thing that I wished I'd had much earlier in my life is training on the ability to manage conflict, because I think I learned that the hard way on the street. But I think if I look at what Confronting Conflict's done with young people who find it hard to manage conflict, and the training provided there as a life skill, that ability to know when to compete, when to collaborate, when to compromise, when to avoid, accommodate, all of those things. What's the right thing to do in this situation, and what are ways in which you can improve your own self-awareness. So, do I know what makes me really angry? Everyone will say, well, yeah, I do. But actually, when you say, well, what is it? Not everyone is aware of what really gets them wound up until they're wound up, and why, and what they might be able to do about that. And that's a whole range of things, from understanding how your body is. So if you're like this, you're probably not comfortable. If you're relaxed, then that's fine. So I think the ability to manage conflict, I think, is a defining characteristic now of leaders. There is so much of what you have to do as a CEO or a chair or a board member, or even a more junior manager. You're basically resolving conflicts quite a chunk of the day. If you're a ward sister in a hospital, you're having some of these awful decisions to take. Who's the doctor going to see next, or who's the nurse going to clean next, or all of those kind of things. So you're managing conflicting ideas, characters, resources, objectives, a whole set of things. So I think that's a fundamental skill.
Interesting. So in an era where we are trying to close the deficit in STEM, science, technology, engineering, our conversation has gone into the softer skills like emotional intelligence and conflict resolution and all that. And if I hear you rightly, your hypothesis is that we need more of these soft skills to sort of complement these other skills like STEM and the rest of them. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. I mean, to be a good board member, I often say you need really good judgment, really good interpersonal skills, and really, really good antennae. And of course, you have to have whatever the functional, sectoral, technical skills. Those are a bit sort of givens. But the differentiating feature of the people who will be the leaders, who will be, the making the big decisions, is probably those other skills on top of those things. I have a big concern at the moment that people's data capabilities, generally, we need more people with more data capability on boards than we've got, as a gross generalization. I mean, there's obviously some absolutely outstanding, outstandingly qualified people who are on boards, but I think the general level of numeracy data.
COVID exposed that to a very large extent with all the data. I remember this was brought up that were being presented to us and to politicians, and some of these experts were baffled at the level of, the numeracy level of even our politicians.
Yeah, because it's not something that was valued. Whereas I think it's becoming more valued, but then there's another voice in people's ears, which is, well, we don't need to bother now. We've got AI, that'll do all that. It's a bit like a super calculator. People don't need to add up. Why would I need to add up? I've got a calculator, people say. Well, actually, if you're negotiating with someone, 11 o'clock at night over a big deal, and you need and they're trying to fiddle around with all the equity percentages and the cap table and all that kind of thing, you probably do need to have those fundamentals to work with. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and also who's going to write these algorithms? Some will be generated themselves, clearly, as on the path we're going. But at the moment, we do need quite a lot of people who are really good at algebra and really good at those kind of things. So I think with most things in life, we need a balance, and some of those balances we want in an individual, and some of those balances we can only really achieve in a team, a multi-ability team to do things. So I think people's understanding of, again, of each other, and this was something that came out very strongly in the 5 Generations book, is, if you look at the challenges that people are having around this, it's basically around not enough time being taken to understand each other, understand a different group and how they think and feel. Why do they feel that? Why do they say that? How we communicate. So are we choosing the wrong method, the wrong way of communicating, which makes it harder to understand people and come up with the right choice? And also, probably one of the biggest things for me is having a maximizing mindset. So a lot of people will focus on little frictions. And it's good to spend time on those, because if you can reduce those little frictions, they don't get bigger, and you solve the little frictions. However, if you spend your life just worrying about the visible problems and not thinking about the big opportunities and how can we maximize, you and I are different. I don't know you very well, but we're different. So if I took time to get to know you and understood, what you were really fantastic at, and actually what might be, an area where you're not so strong, and you did the same with me, we would probably work a lot better together if we were going to work together. If we did that, I think a lot of when you first get to manage people, I've always found, there are lots of different roles. That time you invest in, really trying to understand a person will pay huge dividends later. metaphorically or literally, that it will come back because you'll make better choices. You'll ask them to do things that they really want to do and in the right way. You'll motivate them better. If there's a problem, if they underperform, you'll be able to help them navigate through that in an easier way if you understand them better.
Absolutely. So what initially drew you to the world of governance and leadership? And perhaps from the back of that, what inspired you to write about boards?
So I suppose essentially I got over promoted when I was relatively young at 3i to a job I really wasn't, probably shouldn't have got. It was to manage a workout portfolio. I was relatively inexperienced. So this is basically a portfolio of companies losing money where we had minority equity investments. And when I looked at this portfolio, because we had minority investments, I went to the next board meetings. So, and one of the very first board meetings I went to was just a complete car crash. It was an awful board meeting. Everything you could think of in terms of effective running of a board was sort of not there. And after the meeting, I had a chat with the chair. It's a family company, and I mentioned earlier I'm mild dyslexic, so I don't tend to take very good notes. I'm not a very good note taker because I can't read what the hell I've written. But I use symbols quite a lot, mathematical symbols, and I drew a triangle and it had purpose, people and process, because it seemed to me that I couldn't understand why this family owned the company anymore. The role of the board was really unclear. The role of the executive was really unclear. The role of the family in decision making was unclear. So all these purposes were a bit fused and confused. And then they didn't have the right people and they weren't working together in the right way. So there was purpose and people. And then if you think of the good underpinning processes to make a board work, to make the right decisions, to do it effectively and efficiently, that was all at the creek. So that was the purpose bit. And then I went back to my boss and said, look, when we make an investment, what do we tell people in terms of what we expect the board to do? And what do we tell it? So it's an ignorant question because I was relatively young. I didn't know what we were saying across the piece. And in best boss sort of fashion, he said, oh, interesting point, why don't you write a short note on that? Because that sounds quite interesting. And I did. And then I started to think about what makes a good board, what makes a good board member. And we were investing, across the world. So we were looking at cultural differences. We were looking at all that. And that's when I got into boards in a big way, because I figured the better the board we had, the more money we'd make and the less hassle we'd have. That was my simple appeal to my colleagues was, if we can get a better board. And we became much sharper, I think, about who would get to be on a board of one of our portfolio companies, being much clearer about what the role of the chair was as distinct from the other board members, and making sure we put the right effort into getting the right chairs and changing them if they weren't right and all that. So that's where it all started a very long time ago. But it's been valuable to me, sort of thinking about those things ever since.
Absolutely. So what would you say? Would you say the quality and the caliber of people we have on boards now have improved? Or would you say there's still, a long way to go? I mean, what's your vision for the ideal board?
I think there's been huge improvements in composition. So board diversity is way better than it was. That's not to say it's where it needs to be, because it isn't. So we've made progress.
Why is diversity important? Sorry, Patrick.
Because you get more challenge, you get new ideas, fresh insights. So if you look at where we've made progress on diversity, gender diversity, we've clearly made a lot of progress, not as much as we need to, but made a lot of progress. We've made minimal progress in terms of race diversity. We've made no progress in terms of disability, and we've gone backwards in terms of social diversity. So I don't think we're where we need to be, but I think we are considerably further ahead than we were, say, 20 years ago. The other thing is intergenerational diversity. So one of the things I've been hopefully a pioneer of are next-gen boards. So when we set the EY Foundation up, for example, we set up a next-gen board as we started up, because I felt it was important, because we were focused on young people, that we not only had a youth voice, which many people will say, and it sounds good, but I wanted young people involved in making the decisions. So we put 2 young people on the board, the main board, and we had this next-gen board, and that next-gen board would challenge the board's thinking. We had a member of that next-gen board on each of the subcommittees, so audit and risk, remuneration, nominations. We had to invest in training and support, and they'll have buddies and coaches and so on, but it worked brilliantly. I don't think that the EY Foundation would have had anything like the impact it's had without that. It's called the Youth Advisory Board. Without that in place. And we have now had 5 of those, because they serve for 2 years, they rotate. And we've adapted the model as we've gone. And many of those adaptations have come from the young people saying, we think we could do this differently next time. And so it's been constantly innovating. But there's a whole chapter in the 5 Generations book on next gen boards, and how you might set them up, and things to look out for, and what you need to do, because a lot of people will think it's cool, it's trendy to have a next gen board, but not really put the effort in, and then they fail. So if you're going to do it, you have to do it seriously, I think, and put the effort in.
Absolutely. So in your experience then, should every organization have a board? And if yes, at what stage should a board be constituted?
I think it's a lot about what you want to be. So, if you're a sole proprietor, consultant, or, you've got a fitness training business, but it's just you, and you just want to keep it at that level. You don't want to expand, across the city or town that you're at, or across the country, or then, you probably don't need a board. But if you want to raise external money, if you want to build, a business with, $1 million plus sales, let's say, then you probably need to start thinking about that. So I don't think it's necessarily where you are today. It might be where you want to be, because if you think of the role of the board, it's essentially to make sure that there's the right strategy, you've got the right resources, and you've got the right governance. So if you have that bigger ambition, and a board to start with might be 2, then you might add to 3. I generally advocate adding 1 by 1 rather than trying to microwave a board. Try and microwave your fantasy board. It's pretty tricky, really. I think you need to sort of build as you go, and the needs will change as the business evolves.
And what's the mix? Non-executive, and the chair, and what's the ideal?
It's very context specific, I think, but often I find a model where you have, a sort of independent chair, a CEO, a CFO, and 1 or 2 non-execs. That's a sort of good nucleus, if you like. And then you might grow that. If you're a public company, you need a majority of non-execs. So, you've got that. You've also got to have, an audit and risk, a remuneration, and a nominations committee. Although you might combine the nominations and remuneration committee, so you need people to do that. So there's a capacity kind of driver, if you like. But I am generally in favour of relatively small boards rather than too big a board, but that makes it difficult in terms of achieving the diversity you might want. So you have to be thoughtful about that. But if you have a next gen board, the combination of the board and the next gen board might give you more of that diversity that you need. But I think sort of smaller and more active board members are better than a big group who only just turn up and have barely read the papers. So I think it's as much about character as the innate capabilities than the numbers.
Absolutely. Tell us a bit more about LEAP. We heard about ESSA and EY Foundation. Tell us a bit about LEAP.
So LEAP is a small charity, North London based, which helps young people manage conflict more effectively. So provides a range of training and guidance and tools for young people. The work has involved working with young offenders, young people in gangs, young people on the edge of gangs, people in some of the poorest communities or most violent communities in the UK. And the theory is basically conflict's not necessarily a bad thing, can be a very good thing, can be a spark for creativity and so on. But conflict, if it's not managed well, can escalate and become very destructive. So the techniques that LEAP has, researched, developed, and trains are evidence-based, are kind of solutions-focused in terms of, helping young people. So, we will train them on lots of different scenarios that they may encounter and, what are ways to navigate through that particular situation. Everything from being stopped by the police to someone coming at you with a knife to, an argument, gender-based violence, racial-based violence.
How's the model? Do you get referrals? Do you work in collaboration with schools and colleges?
All of that. Yeah. And there's a limited capacity, obviously, given the scale of that particular problem. We might also get asked to help where there's been a horrible incident, so maybe a murder at a school or something like that, where it's about rebuilding trust, rebuilding confidence. It's about not going for reprisal, but trying to understand why that happened and what you might need to do to stop it happening again. So it's not quick wham bam type work. It's often it's patient kind of thing. And for young people, understanding again why they think and feel that way. And it's unsurprising if someone who's been routinely abused, neglected, isn't cared for, hasn't got a positive role model, male or female, it's not surprising they behave the way they do. And of course, that behaviour might be wrong and unacceptable in terms of the society we live in, but we almost need to think of them as, sometimes they are the victim rather than the perpetrator. And of course, victims can be perpetrators and vice versa. So it's untangling a lot of that. And there's the team are amazing. And have huge experience in doing this, and we publish a lot. There's quite a lot on the website that's really available. But in our dreams, Philippe, we would love every kid in the country, no matter what background they had, would have some robust training, awareness around conflict management. And that's as much for kids in some of the top public schools as it is in some of the poorest estate schools. I think it's not something which, if you look at society at the moment, we don't seem to be as good at managing conflict as we could be as a nation.
Yeah. So do you go into school with LEAP, or are they referred to you?
Both.
And what's the age range of your?
So a lot of the work for the last 30 years has been with 11 plus, with a lot around that 14, 15 and upwards range. We have done work with primary children as well, in particular places where there have been particular issues. But you talked earlier about, the challenges of fundraising. This is one of the most challenging things to raise money for. People don't readily open up their wallets to help young people who've got those kind of profiles. So it is very hard to raise money for. We've been moderately successful in doing that because the impact of the work is phenomenal. If you can help a young person not end up in prison, but end up having a successful adult life and be a successful parent, the economics of that are fantastic because the costs are relatively low. But of course, the government departments have different budgets, and the one that might invest doesn't necessarily feel that they're the one getting the benefit. So again, that tends to be funded by foundations and individuals, high net worth individuals who just think, wow, that's a really cool thing to fund, and might make the area where I live or live near better.
Excellent. Finally, what gives you hope right now, and what inspires you about the next generation of leaders? You are doing a lot of incredible stuff. I don't even know where you get the energy from, Patrick. You're doing work around ESSA, you're doing work around EY Foundation, you're doing work around LEAP, and I know you mentioned a few other stuff in the preamble we had before we went online. How do you get the energy to do all this stuff? Anytime I see you, you're always smiling and full of energy. And just tell us, what inspires, what keeps you going?
I think my mum and my gran would put me to shame in the energy and drive stakes, and they just kind of had this relentless positivity no matter what was happening, and some very difficult things happened for them. They just had that belief that there was someone else not doing as well, and you just had to get up and get on with it. So there's an element of that. There's an element of excitement as well. So I'm very excited about what Africa could become, and I think fulfilling its rightful place in the world. And I don't think without education that's going to be that easy to do. So I think I'm quite excited about the contribution that education can make. The Royal Voluntary Service, I think in the UK, corporates give companies a couple of days a year to volunteer, many do. And someone's worked out that there's 150 million hours of volunteering that isn't taken up. And so one of the things I would love the Royal Voluntary Service to do during my time as chair is to get that number right down. And we're going to try and do that with a new platform, which you'll probably hear and read about later in the year, a new volunteering platform to enable people to volunteer in a much more efficient way, and open up, make the matching so much better and reduce costs for charities in doing so. So I get my excitement from lots of different things. I've got a little granddaughter. I'm going to have another one in a month, and she gives so much joy to the world. And so it's exciting to think what she might become, and it's exciting to think in terms of I've got three boys, and I'm constantly amazed at what they managed to do, and I just think, wow, the world would be brighter if we all sort of believed in young people rather than kind of got confused and irritated by small little things that they did. I'm sure those of us that are not so young anymore, we were probably super irritating. I'm pretty sure I was. And so I think we just have to have more open-mindedness and tolerance and look for the best.
Yeah. Do you feel there are more people like you out there, Patrick?
I think there are loads of people a lot more effective than I am, and doing, much bigger things. And I think what's interesting is when I first started doing this stuff, it seemed a bit unusual to quite a number of people, to hold down a decent corporate job. 3i was a pretty competitive environment, and to be founding things. I founded Work Africa in 2006 and, became Chair of Leap in the early 2000s, and it wasn't so common. Now I think it's more common for people to have, call it what you will, being plural or having a side hustle or whatever it might be. I think it's more common for people to not be, just do one thing. Think to have a range of things, and I have a high need for variety, which is a challenge, but it also does enable you to do different things. But balancing the priorities is challenging, but you need really good teams. So if you want to go down the chair route, you've got to get yourself good CEOs, and I've been incredibly lucky with that. And you've got to build good boards. Then it's not the same degree of work. If you've got a really good exec team, really good leadership team, they understand what they're doing, you understand what you're doing as a board, the intersection is good. It's not the same level of work as if you don't do those things.
Tell us about your books and where we can find them.
Yeah, so the two currently available are Boards, which is published by Governance Publishing, also available on Amazon, and 5 Generations at Work, which is co-authored with Rebecca Robbins, a brilliant woman, and that's published by Wiley, and that's also available on Amazon or all good bookshops or book sites. Both of them are. So I hope they're very practical, and I hope they're very helpful. That's what they were designed to do.
Excellent. Patrick, thank you for your time, insight and generosity today. We highly appreciate having you on Founder Voices. Your leadership journey continues to inspire and guide so many, especially those of us building value-driven ventures from ground up. And to our listeners, if today's conversation gave you insights or challenged your thinking, please share this episode and stay connected by subscribing to Founder Voices. Also, visit my website, www.cottagefactory.co.uk. And we also have a dedicated page for Founder Voices on the website. So that'll be www.cottagefactory.co.uk/Founder Voices. We're also on YouTube. We've got a YouTube channel. Just do a search for Founder Voices and you find us there. And we are on SoundCloud. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, keep challenging, and keep creating change. Thank you. Bye now.